Hello, my name is Margaret Adele, and welcome to a list that I wanted to make for a really long time, the list of neurodivergence and disability in genre fiction. I love indie books, and I want to be able to recommend any kind of indie books to any kind of person, so I'm always trying to find a very wide range so that anyone who asks, hey, do you know of any indie books with this, I can provide some titles. However, at some point, I realized that I didn't really have a lot of books with either neurodivergence or disability in them, and I decided to make a concerted effort to find more of them, and somewhere along the line, that blossomed into a whole list. Now, what you're going to see here is actually both indie and trad books. I do sometimes still read those containing either disabled or neurodivergent characters. However, when I originally asked recommendations for these kinds of books, the replies I got let me know that I need to make some clarifying points. So let's consider this a kind of curator's note before we get into the list proper. First up, what do I mean when I talk about neurodivergence? In the realm of this list, neurodivergence is relating specifically to things like autism, ADHD, sensory disorders, and the like. I had a lot of people giving me recommendations for things like anxiety and depression. However, in a lot of modern discourse, those tend to be labeled under things like mental health. And for the sake of giving this list a solid framework, we are separating them out. So neurodivergence here is autism, ADHD, sensory disorders, and that kind of thing. And later on, if I am feeling up for another giant list, I would love to do a list on mental health topics. Also, within the framework of this list, a character would only be considered for this list if that character was neurodivergent for the entirety of this story. There were a couple recommendations I was given in which an autistic character would travel to this portal world where suddenly they're neurotypical. Does not count. They needed to be neurodivergent for the entire run of the story. When it comes to disability, I was looking for characters that have chronic illnesses or chronic medical conditions that affect their daily lives. So chronic illnesses, diabetes, blindness, deafness, that kind of thing. I was also hesitant, if not outright cutting books off the list, if they featured a character losing a limb, but then gaining a new limb that was just as good, if not better than the original. So for example, if a character loses an arm over the plot of the story and then gets like a cool cyborg arm that's even better, and there's not any real function to them being an amputee within the story, it wasn't really considered. And again, any storyline in which the main focal point is making them not disabled or curing them was not considered. Within the realm of this list, genre fiction is going off of that kind of general book marketing term that is basically every kind of book that isn't contemporary or literary, aka the lowbrow books, as some of the snobbier literary elitists would tell you. But this is basically any book that falls within the realm of a certain genre with these settings, tropes, themes therein. So for example, your horrors, your mysteries, sci-fi, paranormal romance, fantasy, like all of those kinds of things. Yes, again, the more serious, maybe book club type books or contemporary books about these topics are very important. However, I have noticed that in our modern discourse, or really discourse for a long time now, people with disabilities or neurodivergence tend to get relegated to those areas wherein they can only ever be serious. And 90% of the time, these serious books aren't really for them. And in fact, a lot of them tend to be more about teaching abled or neurotypical people. And I was thinking to myself, that's gotta suck. Because, I mean, doesn't everyone want to be the person going into space and talking to the aliens? Or like falling in love with the fairy prince? Or like solving the cool mystery? Or being the superhero? Like, doesn't everybody want that kind of stuff? And so these books are specifically, I don't want to say non-serious because some of them can actually get like dark, but they are specifically focused on disabled and neurodivergent people getting to do the cool stuff and not just be sitting around teaching able-bodied and neurotypical people about themselves. They get to be the ones talking to aliens, solving mysteries, being and or dating superheroes. Like, they get to be the one doing the cool stuff, or rather they are at least a very important character in the cast. And the cast is doing cool stuff. Something like that. Because we all deserve to be a little silly. And with that, let's jump into the list. The Magic Misfits by Neil Patrick Harris. This is a mid-grade kind of historic novel with like some kind of elements of fantasy. Let me explain. This is all about a young boy named Carter who is working on the streets with his evil uncle who is tricking and conning people, and he doesn't want to be about that life. So plot reasons, he escapes and ends up with a group of other kids and their mysterious leader doing sleight of hand type magic. The reason I say like kind of historical is it doesn't really give you much in the way of a solid it happened in this year or this era, but like I get a kind of late Victorian age, golden age of circuses era type feel, which is about the best I can place it. But like also there's like elevators in the hotel, but like nice working elevators. So it's like it's vague ye olden times, but also kind of not place. But of course, the big question is, how is our wheelchair user in this? And her name is Ridley. You can see her on the cover right there. She's not around in the beginning. They sort of introduce everything slowly. But I loved her introduction because literally like one of the first things she says to Carter is like, yes, I'm in a wheelchair. And if you ask me about it, I'll punch you, like, or bloody your nose or whatever. But like she basically threatens violence if he tries to ask prying questions, and like, wonderful. So she also participates in magic and sleight of hand tricks, and it's awesome because she actually like uses her wheelchair in some of the tricks. My favorite being when she will roll over Carter's foot and he looks down and there's masking tape across his foot with a message on it, which I thought was really cool. And in general, she's not that kind of inspiration porn type character. She has a definitive personality that is while not wholly disconnected from the use of a wheelchair, is not solely about it. She is a member of the team regardless, and it is lovely. The book itself is very mid-grade. It is not very universal. It's also very Neil Patrick Harris. A lot of his mannerisms and tone of voice come through, and a lot of things are almost over-explained. And again, I'm a nearly 30-year-old woman reading this book, so like, not really for me. But I also think that this book is not necessarily for the higher end of mid-grade novels. I can't really see like a middle schooler reading this book and not feeling patronized by it. It would really be for like that 3rd to 5th grade sweet spot of middle grade, if you know what I mean. But I liked how she is canonically in a wheelchair. It is brought up. She remains in the wheelchair the entire time, but has an entirely separate character arc, not connected to it, and is still doing like cool magic tricks, and it's a lot of fun. And while Neil Patrick Harris is not a wheelchair user, at least not to my knowledge, this was recommended to me by Ahaga, who is a wheelchair user, so I'm going to assume that she has a greater level of knowledge about this than me, and she's the one that recommended it, so I'm gonna go with that. The Oracle Code by Marika Nycomp. This is a graphic novel set in the DC universe, focused on Barbara Gordon after getting shot and becoming paralyzed from the waist down and using a wheelchair, as we can see on the cover. And this one, the author is disabled, and I had to hold on to that a little bit because over the course of the story, she is sent to this rehab facility, essentially, and there's a lot of talk of like, we will fix you, and I was like, is that really the theme we're going with in this book? But then I was like, no, the author is disabled. Give it a chance. Let's see where they take this. And yes, like, the theme is not, we should be fixing disabled people. The theme is, look at all the crappy people telling disabled people they need to be fixed type of thing. So it resolves itself. But this is all about Barbara Gordon as a teenager. And if I remember correctly, in other comics, the character is older when she gets shot and becomes paralyzed, but I have no idea how DC continuity works. So I don't know if this is like a separate universe in the multiverse, or if this is an entirely separate random standalone story. I have no idea. But while part of the story, a very large part of the story, is Barbara Gordon coming to grips with how to use a wheelchair and basically trying to recover from the PTSD of having been shot and find her old self again, or a new version of herself. There is also like a cool extra mystery. Obviously this isn't a full superhero graphic novel in that there is no fully like superhero-ing going on specifically here. Barbara Gordon is not Batgirl, Batwoman, whatever superhero she ends up turning into in other comics. She is not that in this book, and no one else has superpowers in this book. Although I did appreciate like all the little references to things, like she'd be playing like playing cards in one scene, and the playing cards would have the bat signal on it, or someone had like a stuffed Robin. But the real crux of the plot here was all about the rehab facility she'd been sent to and the mysterious things going on. And of course no one believes her. Of course everyone's like, you should just focus on getting better. And she's like, no, screw you, something's going wrong here. And part of her arc is like, you know what? I was the hacker. I was the person that investigated things, and I'm going to do that again. I'm going to uncover what shady stuff is going on here. And I really appreciated that. And of course, the art style is lovely. Trying not to show too much there. And I really appreciated that. Again, not inspiration porn. It very much shows the struggles, but also overcoming, but in a realistic way where it's not like the protagonist does not exist for someone else's story. She is her own story, which we love. Yay. This has not inspired me to go read more comic books. I still don't know that I could ever get in heavily into superhero comics, but I enjoyed this one. I enjoyed this one a lot. And if you were like maybe wanting to look into some graphic novels, but also like a lot of stuff is scary and it's a big learning curve, you don't really need to know that much about the greater DC universe for this to make sense, for this to be an impactful story. You can kind of just focus on here, but you will need to like really strange, analogous, metaphorical stories, because that's a running theme throughout the book. Is another patient at this rehab facility essentially trying to tell her the secrets of the place, but like in creepy bedtime stories instead. But I enjoyed that as well. That was a lot of fun. The Extraordinaries by T.J. Klune. This is a superhero story with a rom-com twist in that our protagonist, Nikki, lives in a world where superheroes exist, but it's a different vibe than a lot of superhero stories. Very much breaking the fourth wall, very much a lot of like sarcastic quips and that kind of thing. But Nick has ADHD, and you see a lot of that in the story as he struggles with changing medications and how certain medications made him feel like a zombie, and it still feels like he's not fully himself when he's on the pills, but also he struggles to function without them, and how he is so completely oblivious to so much that like you in the story, you're like, oh my gosh, how does he not see this? But it's great. It is a little strange that they renamed the superheroes in this world, because this is a world in which like DC and Marvel comics exist. Those heroes aren't real. The real world has very few but legit superheroes that are called the Extraordinaries, but then you still have like Wonder Woman and Iron Man, like that whole set. So it's kind of a weird mix of reality and fiction within this world. But Nick is an adorable character. He's a total fanboy. It actually begins with the fan fiction he writes with a self-insert character with one of the real world, quote unquote, real world superheroes. But also he starts having conflicting emotions for his childhood best friend Seth, and it's great. I'm also pretty sure that this is a series. I believe I saw on Goodreads that it was listed as the Extraordinaries #1, and it leaves off some pretty big reveals that I think I already know. But then again, I got that one superhero secret identity kind of wrong. So like, maybe it makes it obvious to the reader, but then not like entirely obvious. And I liked it. I loved this. This was adorable. As for the rep, I cannot speak to whether or not TJ Klune is neurodivergent. The little bit of research I did, aka going through his socials and website to see if it was mentioned, did not turn up anything. But however, he is queer, and we love MLM written by queer men. In general, I'm just a really big fan of this, and you definitely see, because it is from his point of view, you get to see the neurodivergence in action, and he has delightfully strange trains of thoughts and how they jump around. But it is fun because while the other characters in the world only hear the things he's blurting out that appear to be totally unconnected to what they were just talking about, you can like follow how he jumps around in his head, and it's really cool. So I would need someone else to like give me a thumbs up, thumbs down on the actual rep of ADHD in here, but I loved it. I'm just a really big fan of this to the extent that like I want to go look up the author's other work because it was so good. This next one is Bellamy and the Brute by Alicia Michaels. What a Beauty and the Beast retelling? How rare! Regardless, this one had popped up in my BookBub deals so many times, and I'd put it off so long, and finally I was like, you know what, we'll just try it. Mostly because of this list. This deals with a young woman named Bellamy, who is hired on as the babysitter for this ultra-rich family, and discovers that on the third floor of their giant house is a teenage boy that used to go to her school, but ever since something went wrong, he has stayed at home. Now, I was really iffy about this at first because even the synopsis kind of alludes to Tate, our quote-unquote brute, having some kind of chronic illness, and I was like, if we're gonna do one of those magic cure things, I'm not sure. But actually what kind of made me give it a chance was the fact that the author and the protagonist are both black. And so I'm like, okay, not the same type of marginalized identity, but a marginalized identity. So like, okay, let's try it. And it actually wasn't even Tate that sold me, and Tate's not even the reason that this book is on this list. Although I will say, as far as magical chronic illnesses go, his was not done poorly. I did appreciate that. I do not remember the exact name of the illness, but it is one where basically the fat and muscle on one side of his face, the words like collapse and evaporate are popping to mind, but basically one side of his face seems sunken in and causes a deformity, and he's very self-conscious about it. What I liked about that aspect is that the book makes it very clear that the family is the one not doing the right thing in regards to the chronic illness. When he finally does start going out and about in town with his full face on view, like, yeah, some characters are dicks about it, but those are the characters that have already been portrayed as the villains. Whereas other people are like, yeah, it's just a dude with a chronic illness. Like, if you make fun of him, you're the asshole. Everyone knows this. Like, you wouldn't mock someone for a disability. Yes, some people would, but I mean, like, you know what I mean. Anyway, what actually clinched this as being on this list is not our Beast insert, but actually the Lumiere insert. As best as I can tell, Ezra is kind of like a personal assistant, but also like household manager. Like, he would be the head steward if this was a Regency era book. But he is a wheelchair user, and I like that he is living this full best life. He's got a cush job. He goes to the gym. He takes hot women out on dates, like living the life. And near the end of the book, he ends up full on tackling a dude, like dives out of his chair to tackle one of the Gaston insert's cronies, and actually goes on to explain to the protagonist that yes, he does technically have use of his legs. He's not a paraplegic, but he has a chronic illness. I do not remember exactly what, some kind of muscular, I want to say dystrophy, but now that sounds wrong when I'm saying that. But some kind of muscular issue. And he explains to the protagonist, Bellamy, that overuse of his legs can cause flare-ups, hence why he uses the chair, which is a very common use for a wheelchair, and is also a very underknown, not well-known use for a wheelchair. A lot of modern society tends to assume that the only people using wheelchairs are paraplegics, and so when, someone with a chronic illness that needs the chair to prevent their illness from flaring up, stands up a little bit to read something on a shelf, everyone's like, liar. And that this book kind of just slips that in, that's actually a misconception, was really nice. And considering all of the wheelchair users I follow who have this as being one of their top complaints about able-bodied people, assuming they must be paraplegic or they must be liars and not need the chair, I probably would rank this pretty high for that aspect alone. So yes, there are in fact Beauty and the Beast retellings that I actually love. Who'd have thunk? One Stolen by D.N. Bryn. Not the only D.N. Bryn book on this list. This one takes place in a kind of flintlock fantasy swamp where there is some elements of futuristic technology, but it's mostly the swamp and the magiciness. This focuses on what the synopsis calls a mer-snake, what the book calls Boyuna, what I call a swamp naga named Cacao, who while is not specifically named as autistic in the text. This was a review book. I have been in contact with the author, and they are like, yeah, it's basically autism. It's a sensory disorder thing, and Cacao is constantly bombarded with all of these sensations around him constantly, and the only thing that can soothe him are these like magical little rocks. Like, they're just everywhere. They power everything, and he is willing to do anything to get them to soothe his sensory disorder, including very bad things that further the plot along and lead to the need for a redemption arc. And I loved that aspect because while yes, he does do like objectively horrible things for these rocks, the book also makes it very clear of just how desperate he is and how much he needs them, and I really like that aspect. It is written by an author who they themselves, I don't know, is not autistic but has a sensory disorder, so it's not entirely own voices unless D.N. Bryn has secretly been a swamp naga this whole time. Regardless, it does definitely feel like you understand exactly where he's coming from. But on top of that, this is also a society in this bog where people are majority deaf, just because this bog has such a stillness to it, and there are so many vibrations in the water and the air that entire species have basically gone deaf because they don't need their hearing as much. And a lot of the other people, humans living in towns around the bog, have also kind of developed deafness as a lack of need for hearing. And one of my favorite parts of it was one of the few hearing characters, called Tice. She keeps trying to coach people on how to pronounce her name, but all of the characters like, we're deaf. That makes no difference to us how to pronounce your name. We're never gonna hear it or say it. This is a world where, again, deafness is so common that pretty much everyone signs. It's just a thing you do. But I just love that there's this one hearing character that is like very determined to get all of the deaf characters to know how to pronounce her name. Made me laugh, that one. But it is a lovely, lovely tale. I really liked the world building in it. It was so very fantasy. And this is one of the times where I know in a lot of instances people are like, hey, don't make your marginalized inserts be non-human. But the nice thing about this is because deafness is so prevalent, and because despite the fact that he is a swamp naga, Cacao's sensory needs are so humanly written. In my head, that phrasing made sense. Despite the fact that he has scales and a giant tail, and it's really cute, like when the romance starts and he like uses it to wrap around Tice, it's ugh. But despite the fact that it's like it's a non-human creature, they feel like such human emotions that it doesn't feel necessarily othering. So I really, really appreciated that. And in general, D.N. Bryn is just a great pick for disability or neurodivergence rep, also ACE rep. This will not be the only book by them on this list, so be on the lookout for them as an author, just in general, if you want more of that kind of thing. This next entry is me shamelessly trying to manipulate an indie author into writing another book. So this one is for Gay Love and Other Fairy Tales by Dylan James. for the most part, this book is about two, as far as I can tell, fully able-bodied and neurotypical boys, as one comes out of the closet and the other deals with whether or not he wants to come out, and of course they're in love, or like they fall in love. You know, that classic queer story of out queer character meets closeted queer character, and can they make it work, and all of that kind of aspect, with some high school drama thrown in. I don't usually like high school books, but I did like the fact that there was a side character, Kumail, who becomes the boyfriend of the gay character's best friend. So he is decently involved in things, and he is deaf, and both the protagonist and protagonist's best friend know sign and sign to each other, and Jordan actually like learns, or at least gets better at signing for the sake of Kumail, and there's a lot of focus on how do they make their prom accessible for the deaf student, and it was really interesting, and admittedly, it's just a side character. However, this author has brought up that he would be interested at some point in writing an MLM romance, as that's most of what he does, with a deaf or hard of hearing character. The author himself uses a hearing aid, and like, I will never pass up the opportunity to lovingly nudge the indie authors within my sphere, because I really like the representation of Kumail in this one, even if he was just a side character. I really like that it was just a given that there should be signing, just a given that there should be accessibility, and that like the one or two characters that complained were very clearly like the villains of it. I will say the romance as a whole definitely had a very, very big fantasy wish fulfillment type of thing, where it did come across like the closeted character should have just come out sooner, which is always the iffy thing, because sometimes people are closeted for a reason and you shouldn't be trying to nudge them out when it could actually be a danger to their safety. But regardless, other than that, unintentional, I'm going to say that was an unintentional side effect that a lot of these coming out stories have. It was a very sweet romance, and I really think that if this author put his mind to it, he could create a very, very sweet romance with a deaf character. And it could be either adult or a YA. This one was YA, but the author does do a lot of work in adult MLM. Obviously, the adult stuff is spicier. I've read some of those too, but I would love to see it. So consider this my helpful little nudge. If you've been watching my channel for a while, I apologize that you have to listen to me talk about this book again. Starmark Rising by Shami Stovall, the first review book I ever got from an author, the one I talk about incessantly, the one I finally, after 3 years, got the sequel to, but I'm also like low-key nervous to review it. So this is all about a disaster bisexual cyborg named DeMarco, who really wants to live planet-side. In this world, living on an actual planet is kind of a cush thing that only the wealthy and elite can do. Most of the common people are stuck on space stations, and so he gets a job with this very charismatic captain on this ship, the Starmark, and hopes to basically follow her coattails up to being wealthy enough to be planetside. But in doing so, he discovers more about the world around him. You see, he himself is not disabled. However, the world in which this book takes place in the far-flung future, humans decided, for whatever reason, that they wanted to make superhumans. They wanted to create, like, ultimate super people. And as a result, they started messing with the genetic code of humans over and over and over again with future generations. And they succeeded in creating superhumans that are now, like, the top of the food chain. However, as a result of all of those genetic tests, they also introduced a ton of birth defects and genetic disorders into the general populace. And you would think that because they are the direct result of humans messing up, that they would treat these disabled people with kindness, but no. A little bit of a minor spoiler here, but DeMarco discovers while on the ship that a lot of the people on the ship are actually secretly disabled because society has forced them to hide it, because if it was well known, they would be fired, they would have the worst time getting jobs, they would be looked down on, and the superhumans that they created are put on these incredibly high, perfect pedestals. They're the ones that are governors. They're the ones that are controlling everything. So this entire book really functions as an analogy for the poor way people treat disability and how, for some reason, we live in a society that equates body workingness, body mechanics with worth. And also, it acts as a giant FU to eugenics. And in general, yes, I did love this book. I am super looking forward to eventually getting up the courage to read the sequel as I film this. I do have it sitting on my shelf, but it has been literally 3 years that I have been hyping this up, and there is a certain character that needs their comeuppance, and I'm excited for it, but highly would suggest this one. Wildfire Griffin by Zoe Chant. This is one of my all-time favorite indie shifter romance series. I don't even remember the full name of it because this author tends to write all of her shifter romances in the same worlds with similar occupations, and so the names of the series get so mixed up in my head. But this one in particular deals with hotshot firefighters, and the hotshots are the ones that go into wildfires to contain them. And it is all about them finding their true mates, which is a very common shifter trope. But our first book here deals with a Griffin shifter named Rory, who's kind of like the head of this team of shifters, finding his true mate Edith, who is also a firefighter and autistic. When he first discovers her, she is basically on fire watch because she has been pushed to the side because of her neurodivergence and has a lot of trauma associated with it, but it is not the entirety of her character, and she is an exceedingly capable hotshot in her own right. Very well trained and very much a badass, and I really liked that. In a lot of cases, autistic characters tend to be infantilized and sidelined, and Edith gets to be a full-on total badass. Later on in the series, which might be a little bit of a spoiler, but I just have to talk about this moment. Supernatural things are going down. There's wildfires being caused by supernatural things, and they end up doing the fight scenes and stuff. There's a moment later on in the series, and I don't remember what book it was, where Rory is actually knocked unconscious, and she is standing over his body with an axe, swinging at what I can only describe as demons. And that moment lives in my head rent-free. Not a dime of rent. I love it so much. And this book actually has what I would usually consider a very annoying trope, but because it is tied to her autism, it actually is a good thing here. And that is the fact that she keeps her autism a secret for a very long part of the book because of very realistic trauma in her past, where she was told to mask, she was told to stop simming, she was told that, doing all these things is weird and you shouldn't do that, so she keeps it to herself, thinking that they won't like her when she finds out about it. And usually in these moments where there's a big, deep, dark secret and it comes out and it doesn't matter, I get annoyed. But in this case, that was exactly the right call. When it comes out that she's autistic, everyone on the team was like, okay, what do you need from us? Do we need to avoid eye contact? What do you need? That was really nice that it wasn't a thing, but at the same time, it made sense that in her head it was a thing because of very realistic past trauma that a lot of autistic people face, and she also gets to be a badass. Later on in the series, you do have other characters that have things like anxiety disorders, ADHD, ADD, that kind of thing, and it actually, in some cases, actually affects their shifter abilities, which I thought was really cool. I really like that aspect, and I'm also really excited because this author is continuing with this series. It was completed in 2021, and the next generation of this series is also going to have another autistic character. And considering how well she handled it here, I am very excited to see how, I believe his name was Rupert, works in the next one. Survival Kit by Ahaga. This is a zombie apocalypse story all about a wheelchair user named Kit and her wife, who are doing that very classic zombie apocalypse plot where they are traveling across the very dangerous terrain in the hopes of reaching this sanctuary they've heard about where they will be safe. It is a very standard story in that aspect. However, there are very many ways in which it is very different. The first one being one of the main characters, well, both the main characters are queer. One of the main characters is a wheelchair user. And I don't remember the exact name of her chronic illness, but it does flare up at times. It is one of the many, many struggles they must overcome in this zombie apocalypse. And really, it adds an entire extra level of tension to the entire story because, like with a lot of chronic illnesses, exertion can make things a lot worse, but they can't afford to not exert. They have to get to the sanctuary. They're fighting off zombies and your classic raiders. And so there's always this fear throughout the book that even if they get to the sanctuary, even if it's real and they get there, Kit's illness might flare up so badly that they won't really have succeeded in their goal anyway. And it's this very tense and kind of bittersweet idea that really stands in as a kind of analogy for chronic illness in general, that so many times people with chronic illness are forced to push themselves in ways they shouldn't. And it was a really cool analogy in that way. The mechanics of the zombies are also a lot different. It's not necessarily the bite of a zombie. The virus or parasite, I can't remember now, it's been so long since I read it, that infected everyone is still in the water supply, and I believe is also in certain kinds of meat. So that not only do they have to find food, they also have to find the right kind of food and water so that they still don't accidentally turn into zombies. And also, this is a book that is not set in America. It is set in, I believe, Norway. Editing Margaret. Yes, no, Norway? Thank you. Definitely not America, though, which didn't necessarily take me too much out of it. I think if you are American reading this, the most notable things is the name drop of European-esque city names, the fact that they call what we would call daycares kindergartens, and the fact that there's a bunch of train stations that are just sitting around. America doesn't have a lot of train stations. We should, though. Regardless, I really, really liked the mechanics of the zombies, a non-American setting, and again, just getting to watch either a neurodivergent or disabled person taking down supernatural creatures with an axe. Apparently that's just one of my favorite things. That's a really niche thing, but could we make it a trope? Could we make a neurodivergent or disabled character kicking ass with an axe? Be a fiction trope, please. Regardless, I am really excited because the author is making an entire series based on this concept of how would a person with X disability live and survive in a zombie apocalypse, which is just a really cool idea. As I am filming this, I have gotten the next review copy for the next in the series, which involves a person that has type 1 diabetes living in a zombie apocalypse. I'm really excited for that one. And this one, the series in general, would probably just be a treasure trove for anyone that wants a lot more disability rep. Yes, Ahaga is a disabled woman. I believe she calls herself a witch in a wheelchair, which is just fun. So I am excited for that. Our Bloody Pearl by D.N. Bryn. Yes, the next D.N. Bryn book, although technically this one is the first in the series, These Treacherous Tides. However, this series is linked more by concept than chronology, so technically you could read either this or One Stolen as a standalone, and there are the same side characters in both, and I really like that, but mostly this one does deal with disability, very much, namely, how to work through things after you have become disabled. Disability is one of the few marginalized identities, or I believe the only marginalized identity, that you can grow up or spend a large portion of your life not being in, and then later on something happens and you're in it. And this book deals a lot with that. Our protagonist is a siren named Pearl, who basically has been kept trapped on this evil pirate ship. They have been tormented, and as a result of the torture, their tail is no longer fully functional. And they are saved by this dashing good pirate named Dijon, who rescues them, but they don't entirely trust him. However, because of their mostly non-functioning tail, they are not able to escape, and so a large portion of the story is Dijon trying to help them and trying to create a way for them to be able to swim again. And there's also an element of like they create their own form of sign language. Not that any character is deaf, but purely because the way siren vocal cords work versus the way that human vocal cords work, they functionally can't speak each other's language. Like, they don't have the, like, actual equipment in their throats to speak the languages appropriately, so they come up with their own sign language, essentially, to do it instead. And, I don't want to get too much into it, so I'm trying not to spoil, but suffice to say, over the course of the story, Dijon also becomes disabled through plot, and it is basically both of them having to figure out how to operate now that they have these injuries that have led to prolonged disabilities, and there's a lot of railing against it and the anger and grief that comes with it, and having to find a new normal, which I really, really liked as a theme. As a complete side note, as you probably have noticed, this book also has gender non-conforming characters. The sirens as a whole can actually switch between, like, anatomy, so they don't have any concept of gender, because it's whoever wants to be the one getting pregnant, bam, is capable. Whoever wants to be the one impregnating, bam, is capable. And as a result, they don't see gender the same way, which is a really fun, like, species feature, I think. And then, of course, we have some sapphic side characters, and also both Pearl and Dijon in our adorable romance are ace, which answers a lot of questions of how would a romance work between them. Like, there's still some kissing, but it's like, I don't want to have to try and think about the actual mechanics of that. Regardless, really, really good story. Really, really like all of the themes and subplots in it. And of course, it's just a fun steampunk pirate mermaid siren story. Like, who wouldn't love that? The Sword of Summer by Rick Riordan. This is a YA fantasy all about a teenage boy that discovers he is the son of one of the Norse gods, and a lot of stuff happens. He ends up in Valhalla, you know, so on and so forth. But I wanted to talk about the character of Hearth from this book. And I was debating whether or not to include it, because technically Hearth is a side character. He is one of the friends that Magnus makes while he is homeless. He is a deaf elf that is adept in rune magic based on the Nordic runes. But the reason I decided to add it in was because past this book, in the second book, there's a lot more focus on him, and you see a lot more of his backstory, and there are entire sections of that book that are in fact totally focused on Hearth's family and backstory, so it feels more like he's a cast member than just a random side character. And it's a little bit complicated to explain everything in the little section of this list, but suffice to say, Hearth once had a magic fantasy decision. He could either choose to gain hearing or choose to gain magic powers with his rune stones, and he chose the runes, and his uppity family is basically furious that he picked that, and they're constantly looking down on him because he is deaf. And he also has issues with a brother that he lost, and feeling like he's constantly trying to make up for that, and actually low-key limiting himself and the runes he can use, and limiting the extent of his magic because of angsty backstory reasons that I won't reveal. They are revealed in book 2. But because he gets all of that development and all of that depth, that's why I decided to include him. So it's not necessarily like this book specifically that I want to put on the list, but this series. I have not continued with it yet past book 2, because book 3 is actually a giant crossover with Percy Jackson, and I'm still working through Percy Jackson, so I have a ton of those books to read first, even though low-key I like this series more than the original Percy Jackson, which actually isn't that much of a hot take, I have discovered. But anyway, I really like how Hearth is included in this, and so many of the other characters use sign, and sign is normalized, and how he has what is basically an analogy for the prejudice deaf people face when there is an option to get whatever surgery is available for like cochlear implants or whatever, and they choose not to, and people like look down on them for it. Like, why don't you want to be cured of your deafness? You know? So it's a really interesting analogy in that way. And in general, I just love the character of Hearth. He's one of those like quiet, kind of broody types, but also really sweet. And him and Blitz as an odd couple pair are just adorable. I mean, I don't think they're actually romantic in any way, but like the vibe between them as besties is just perfection. Where Shadows Lie by Allegra Pescatore. This is a high fantasy, which would usually be a very hard sell for me, but this one is so much fun because the synopsis begins with the sentence, "The chosen one is dead." And a lot of the main crux of the plot is a twist on a very stereotypical fantasy trope, wherein you have the strapping prince who is going to overthrow his tyrant father through the help of all of these rebel friends he has made. Only he fails in the very first scene of the book because he didn't bother to tell his younger sister what was happening despite doing all of this to protect her. So Eleanor interferes when the rebels attempt to kill the king and gets the quote-unquote chosen one killed. And she's confused. She doesn't understand why it happened because, again, dude was so protective that he didn't even bother to tell her and just considered it a non-issue. No one was expecting her to be able to interfere that much. And so instead, our disabled, disaster bisexual princess Eleanor gets to be the one that is the center of the overthrowing the tyrant king plot, and I really, really liked that a lot. And I'm not exactly sure what the disability is. It's kind of that high fantasy thing where it's very, very clearly a disability, but they don't use modern terminology for it. But as a child, she underwent a severe illness that low-key kind of sounds like polio, and then as a result has to use mobility aids for a while and still has issues with her legs when she overexerts herself. And there's also themes of her family, because they're all royals and are obsessed with the way they appear, will often like order her to not use her mobility aids in public because it's a bad look. But there's also some fun scenes where her on again, off again lover, her bestest gal pal, they were friends, roommates even, helps massage her legs in fun ways and distracts her while she's massaging with distracting things. It was a fun scene. I appreciated it, but I just love the idea of taking a character that would be like the sickly little sister that the brave young chosen one must protect and be like, no, off him, she's the main character now. Like, that's just awesome. I love this. And the author is disabled, and this series will be continuing as I film this. I have no idea if it's out at the time that you're seeing this because of how long it is taking me to film all of this, but I do have the sequel. It is on my list, so I'm not going to add it to this list because it is the sequel, and I figure if you take this recommendation, you will likely decide whether or not you want to continue with the series on your own. But I just like this one. It's a very nice tip-off for a new kind of high fantasy that lets the people who would have been sidelined by traditional high fantasy get the spotlight for once. This last one is strangely personal, but I'll talk about the book first and then we'll get into why it felt personal. So that is Failure to Communicate by Kaya Sonderby. This is a space opera all about a young autistic woman who works as I believe the word from the book is like xeno-liaison. Basically, whenever a new planet with a new species is uncovered, it is her job to study them and try and uncover the best way to make first contact with them and establish some kind of alliance, or at least convince them not to attack other people. And she has such an up in this because she basically had to figure out how to make contact with her own race. And this book deals a lot with politics, a lot with negotiations as they try to essentially convince this militaristic planet not to give their big weapons away to the evil people, which the evil aliens are orcs. And I'm a little bit disappointed by that. I'm a little bit annoyed with evil orcs in general. But you don't really see them, and they aren't super stereotypical orcs, so like I'll give them that. But anyway, Xandri basically has to figure out very, very human and difficult discussions. Although the race technically isn't strictly human, they're human enough to be an issue for an autistic woman who has always struggled to deal with communicating with their own race. And it might be a little bit slow in the center for people who don't like a lot of that kind of political talk. However, it does have a nice gigantic ending. I have begun the sequel, but I had to stop because this book hit a chord for me that I was not expecting. Because I saw way too much of myself in Xandri to let it slide. Which I have seen myself very deeply in autistic coded characters before. Think like, well, Velma from Scooby-Doo or Temperance Brennan from Bones. Like, I have very highly connected with the very autistically coded characters. And then for a character to be so blatantly labeled and not coded, but canonically autistic, talking about autism, and I'm reading this book going, this all sounds really familiar. Might have had a mini breakdown about it. It's fine. I'm not questioning everything about myself and wondering if I need to call somebody. That's fine. I haven't, for the record, and obviously I'm not going to suddenly start walking around calling myself autistic just because I read a character in a book, but there was something about the way Xandri was written and the way she connected to people and her thought process that so struck a chord with me to the extent that I'm like trying to read the sequel and trying to ignore a lot of things in my own head because things. Regardless, I would highly suggest this one. There is a slight possibility, if I'm reading between the lines, there is a possibility for a polyamorous romance, and I'm here for it. But this book especially ends on a fairly gigantic cliffhanger that'll leave you wanting to read the second immediately. But in general, I'm deeply wondering if I've learned something about myself. But no, like, seriously, who do you call? Anyway, I definitely would suggest this one for anyone who wants to see an autistic woman being the cool person that gets to meet aliens. So that's it. That's the list. And I understand that that's a weird note to end on, but I thought it was pertinent to share how this list has unexpectedly affected me. Now, my notes are telling me that I have 13 books on here, and obviously there are many more speculative works or genre fiction that have neurodivergent or disabled characters. So if you know of any, again, specifically where no one is magically cured, please put that down in the description below. If you are an indie author that has a book like this and you might be interested in a review, feel free to send me an email. That info will be down in the description as well. I would not be against doing a part 2 of this. However, it would likely be a while just because a lot of the books that were on this list I had read before starting this list, like before deciding to do it. So if I was to start reading for a brand new one, it would probably take me even longer. But it was a lot of fun, and I would not be against that. With nothing else to say, I hope you have a wonderful day, and a marvelous tomorrow.